Some deaths are accidents. This one was a choice. 100 small choices. You arrive at the beach after hours on the road. The Gulf is warm. The sky is clear. Families are laughing. The waves look harmless. Somewhere nearby, a red flag snaps in the wind, but it doesn't shout. It doesn't chase you back to your car. It simply waits. The ocean never argues. It never bargains. It gives you every opportunity to walk away before quietly testing whether you understand what that flag actually means. Beneath the surface, invisible rivers are already flowing away from shore. They do not care if you're young. They do not care if you can swim. By the time you realize the water has made its decision, yours have already been made. These are the warnings they ignored. This is preventable. Vacation begins. The clock starts. Birmingham, Alabama sits nearly 6 hours from the Florida coast, and for 3 young men, that drive felt like the start of something ordinary. A summer weekend, a break from routine, sand, sun, a rented house near the water. It was the kind of trip millions of people take every year without incident. A short window of time carved out of work and life, planned around nothing more complicated than good weather and good company. There was nothing in the plan that suggested danger. There rarely is. For Harold Denzel Hunter, Jamonda Ray, and Marius Richardson, their vacation outing would be their last. They arrived at Panama City Beach on the 21st of June, 2024, tired from the road and ready to shade the hours behind the wheel in the easiest way available to them, the water in front of their rental. According to Bay County Sheriff Tommy Ford, the men had only just checked into their Airbnb before heading toward the Gulf. There was no unpacking, no settling in, just road dust, humidity, and the pull of the surf waiting a few hundred feet from the front door. It is worth pausing on how ordinary that impulse is. After 6 hours in a car, the sight of open water does something to the body. It promises relief. It promises release. For most visitors, that promise is kept without complication. The Gulf of Mexico spends most of its days behaving exactly as expected. Warm, forgiving, forgettable in the way calm water often is. That reputation, earned across thousands of uneventful afternoons, is precisely what makes the exception so dangerous. People do not walk toward water they believe is hostile. They walk toward water they believe they already understand. Hunter, Ray, and Richardson were not strangers to each other in the way 3 friends sometimes are. Ray and Richardson were cousins, bound by family as much as friendship, the kind of relationship that comes with a lifetime of shared holidays and easy trust. Hunter rounded out the group, close enough to be considered family in every way that mattered. All 3 were young fathers. Somewhere back in Alabama, children were expecting their fathers home in a few days, tanned and full of stories about the beach. That was the plan. That was always the plan. There is a particular danger in arriving somewhere unfamiliar and treating it like somewhere familiar. A pool is a pool, a lake is a lake. But a Gulf beach under a red flag is not a swimming pool, and the water does not extend the same courtesy to first-time visitors that it does to those who grew up reading its moods. Locals along that stretch of coastline learned early to check the flags before they checked the temperature. They learned to glance at the pole near the beach access before they even set down a cooler. Tourists, arriving with only a few days to enjoy the water, often skip that step entirely, treating the beach as a backdrop rather than an environment with its own rules, its own hazards, its own quiet grammar of warning signs that means nothing to someone seeing it for the first time. The most dangerous decision these 3 men made was not wading into deep water. It was assuming that a beach this beautiful could not also be a beach this lethal. That single assumption, reasonable sounding, shared by countless visitors before them, repeated on beaches up and down the coast every single summer, was the first link in a chain that would close within hours. The Gulf had already announced the danger long before they ever stepped onto the sand. The ocean had already spoken. Every public beach along the Florida Panhandle uses a flag system, a color code meant to translate a chaotic, invisible hazard into something a stranger can understand at a glance without needing a meteorology degree or a lifetime of local knowledge. Green means calm, low hazard, safe conditions for typical swimming. Yellow means moderate surf and currents, a caution that asks swimmers to stay alert and stay close to shore. Red means high hazard, strong surf, strong current, a warning that should send all but the most experienced swimmers back to dry sand entirely. Double red means the water is closed to the public, no exceptions, No judgment calls left to the individual standing on the beach with a towel in hand. On the 21st of June, a single red flag was flying over Panama City Beach. That flag was not decoration. It was not a suggestion aimed only at children building sandcastles at the waterline. It was a direct translation of conditions the National Weather Service had already been broadcasting across the Gulf Coast for days. An elevated, in some forecasts high, risk of rip currents, driven by wind and swell patterns that had nothing to do with how the surface looked from a beach chair. Meteorologists do not issue these advisories casually. They are built from measurable data: wind direction, swell period, tidal timing, the shape of the sandbars just offshore, patterns tracked and modeled well before anyone books a rental house. When that data lines up in a certain way, the advisory goes out regardless of how blue the sky happens to be that afternoon, regardless of how many families are already unpacking coolers along the sand. This is the cruelty of a rip current. It does not announce itself the way a storm does. There is no darkening sky, no distant thunder, no dramatic buildup that gives a swimmer time to reconsider a choice already half made. In fact, rip currents often form in the calmest looking sections of water, in the gaps between sandbars where the surface can appear glassy and inviting compared to the churn on either side. Swimmers are drawn to that calm without understanding that calm is exactly the signature of the danger. The very feature that makes a patch of water look safest is often the feature that makes it lethal, a cruel inversion built into the geometry of the coastline itself. A rip current does not pull a person under, it pulls them out. It is a river within the ocean, a narrow, fast-moving channel of water rushing back to sea after waves push water toward shore. It can move faster than a strong swimmer can fight, speeds that have been measured well beyond what even trained athletes can outpace over any real distance. And because it runs parallel to the shoreline for a stretch before releasing its grip further out, the most common instinct in the middle of it, swim straight back to the beach, is often the least effective option available. The current is not trying to trap anyone forever. It is simply moving water from one place to another, and anyone caught inside it is moving too, whether they intend to or not. That week, emergency responders in Bay County had already answered multiple water rescues, each one a warning shot that went largely unheard beyond the immediate area, each one a preview of what was still to come. Lifeguards and officials had been repeatedly urging tourists to stay out of the Gulf under existing conditions, using loudspeakers, posted signs, direct conversations on the sand, and public statements to local media. This was not a quiet warning issued once and forgotten. It was active, ongoing, and specific to those very days, repeated by multiple agencies through multiple channels, aimed directly at the kind of visitor least likely to already know better. None of it stopped anyone from walking into the water. The sun overhead did not know a red flag was flying. It kept shining, indifferent, casting the kind of golden light that makes danger look like a postcard. Families photographed the shoreline. Waves rolled in with a rhythm that looked to the untrained eye entirely benign, almost lazy in the late afternoon heat. Sunshine suggested safety. The current, moving silently beneath that same sunlight, suggested otherwise. Only one of those two signals was telling the truth, and it was the one nobody could see, the one that required trust in a flag instead of trust in one's own eyes. Nature had done everything it could to communicate the danger. The next decisions belonged entirely to people, 100 small choices. There was no single fatal mistake that afternoon. There was a sequence, each link ordinary on its own, each one adding weight to the one before it until the chain could no longer be broken. The excitement of arrival did what excitement often does. It overrode caution. Hours on the road, the anticipation of a long-awaited weekend, the sight of open water after a landlocked drive. These things compress judgment in ways people rarely notice in the moment. There was no pause to ask what the flag meant, no glance toward a lifeguard stand, no 5 minutes spent reading a posted sign explaining the color code stenciled onto a wooden post at the beach access. The water was simply there, warm and inviting after a long drive, and so they went in, the way thousands of visitors go in every single day without a second thought. They entered water that looked calmer than it was. That is the design of a rip current. It does not look like danger. It looks like the safest, smoothest patch of ocean on the beach, the exact spot a tired traveler might choose, specifically because it looks gentler than the surf breaking nearby. Somewhere in the patch, the current took hold. silent and unannounced, exactly as it had been forecast to do. A rip current separates swimmers from the shoreline with a speed that is difficult to convey to anyone who has not felt it. What began as a normal swim became, in a matter of seconds, 3 men being pulled away from the sand faster than they could process. The distance between them and safety did not close gradually. It opened suddenly and kept opening, the beach shrinking behind them at a rate that outpaced comprehension. The physiological instinct in that moment is almost universal. Swim toward shore, swim hard, fight the water head on, because the shoreline is the only fixed point the eye can find, the only landmark that still means safety. It is the single most common mistake made by rip current victims, and it is not a failure of character. It is what every human nervous system defaults to when the shoreline is the only visible reference point for safety. Swimming parallel to the beach out of the current's narrow channel is the technique that actually works, the one lifeguards and safety officials repeat in every public advisory, printed on brochures handed out at rental counters up and down the coast. But that technique requires calm, deliberate thought under stress. And calm is the first thing a rip current takes from a person the moment the ground disappears beneath their feet. As the men fought the current directly, their energy began to drain in the way that only real exertion drains it. Not gradually, but in a steep curve. Sprinting against a moving current burns through muscle glycogen far faster than ordinary swimming, and the body has no reserve built for that kind of sustained, panicked effort against a force that does not tire, does not slow, does not negotiate. Within minutes, fatigue stopped being a sensation and became a limitation. Arms that had been strong moments earlier began to lose the strength to pull. Legs that had carried them easily across the sand began to cramp and seize under the strain. And there is one more layer to this kind of emergency that makes it uniquely dangerous. It rarely stays a single-person crisis. When one man in the group began to struggle, the instinct of the others, friends, cousins, family, was to help. That instinct, as noble as it is, often turns one person in trouble into 3 people in trouble. There was no longer one swimmer needing help. There were 3 simultaneously, each one's panic compounding the others, at each rescue attempt draining the very energy that might have been used to reach shore alone. This is the pattern that repeats across so many multiple fatality drownings. Not carelessness multiplied by 3, but loyalty multiplied by 3, arriving at the same tragic outcome. Evening light was beginning to soften by the time distress calls reached emergency dispatch. Fading visibility narrowed the window for both the swimmers trying to reorient themselves and the responders trying to locate them in darkening water. Every minute that passed made the search that much harder, the water that much colder to the eye, the margin for error that much thinner. Somewhere on the beach, other visitors were only beginning to notice something was wrong. The calm afternoon fracturing into something no one had expected when they laid out their towels that morning. The rip current was not trying to drown anyone. It simply continued doing exactly what physics demanded, indifferent to the fact that 3 families were about to lose someone they loved. When physiology takes over. What happens inside a drowning body is not dramatic in the way film and television have taught people to expect. There is no long, visible struggle, no repeated cries for help, audible over open water carrying clearly to shore. Drowning, in its real form, is often quiet, fast, and easy to mistake from a distance for splashing, for horseplay, for nothing at all. A detail that explains why bystanders so often fail to recognize what is happening until it is already too late to help. The body sprints against the current, burning through oxygen at a rate the lungs cannot resupply quickly enough. Heart rate spikes driven by both exertion and adrenaline, blood redirected toward straining muscles. Muscles, first in the legs, then through the whole body, begin to seize with fatigue, each cramp stealing a little more control, a little more ability to coordinate the deliberate strokes that might have carried them free. Breathing turns shallow and rapid as panic sets in, a state in which the body prioritizes air over rhythm, over technique, over anything resembling controlled swimming. At some point, water breaches the airway. A cough reflex tries to expel it, but that reflex costs precious air that cannot be replaced fast enough. Hyperventilation gives way to breath holding, then to involuntary gasping. Water enters the lungs. Oxygen levels in the blood begin a steady, unstoppable decline. a state known as hypoxia. Consciousness dims, muscle control fails. The body that was fighting the ocean stops fighting, not out of surrender, but because it no longer has the physiological capacity to continue the fight it never should have had to wage in the first place. None of this happens over a dramatic stretch of minutes on screen the way it does in fiction. It happens quietly, over a handful of minutes in open water, largely unseen by anyone standing on the beach enjoying the last of the daylight, unaware that a few hundred feet away, 3 lives were already narrowing toward their end. Around 8:11 that evening, emergency dispatch received calls reporting 3 swimmers in distress in the Gulf near Panama City Beach. What followed was a rescue operation that mobilized nearly every resource the region had available on short notice, agencies converging from land, sea, and air in the fading light. The Bay County Sheriff's Office responded immediately. Bay County Emergency Services followed close behind, ambulances staged along the beach access road. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission joined the search, bringing additional boats and personnel trained in open water recovery operations. The United States Coast Guard extended the search further offshore, into water increasingly difficult to cover as daylight failed entirely and the horizon disappeared into a flat, featureless dark that swallowed every visual landmark. Boats swept the surf in coordinated patterns, running grid lines back and forth across the last known position. Spotlights cut across dark water, searching for any shape that did not belong among the waves. Radios carried updates back and forth between agencies that do not often need to combine forces at this scale, but did so that night because the situation demanded every available hand, every available hour. The search continued into full darkness, hour after hour, the kind of search where hope narrows with every passing minute but does not disappear until it has no choice left. Searchers worked the same stretch of water again and again, widening the pattern as the night wore on, aware that time was working against everyone still out there, aware too of what that widening search likely meant. Eventually, all 3 men were located and pulled from the water. All 3 were transported to area hospitals. All 3 were pronounced dead. The rescue ended. The consequences had only begun. The cost of ignoring one flag. Families in Birmingham who had been expecting a phone call about sunburn and good food instead received the kind of call that reorders a life permanently, the kind that arrives in the middle of an ordinary evening and ends it instantly. They traveled the same 6 hours their sons, brothers, and cousins had driven days earlier, not for a reunion, but to identify them at a hospital hundreds of miles from home, in a city they had never planned to know this way. Public statements in the aftermath repeatedly emphasized one detail above the others. All 3 men left children behind. 3 sets of kids who will grow up with a single specific absence traced back to one red flag, one afternoon, one current that formed exactly where the water looked most inviting, exactly where a tired traveler would most want to swim after a long drive. Sheriff Tommy Ford spoke publicly in the days that followed, urging beach goers to respect warning flags, framing the deaths as the tragic result of ignoring a system designed precisely to prevent this outcome. His message was not new. Similar warnings had been issued for days before this incident and would be issued again after it to different visitors on different stretches of the same coastline, to people who had never heard of Harold Hunter, Jamonda Ray, or Marius Richardson and had no reason to think their own trip could end the same way. But warnings only work on people willing to receive them before the water, not after. This was not an isolated afternoon along that stretch of coastline. In the days surrounding this incident, Bay County recorded an unprecedented cluster. 6 tourist drownings within a 4-day span, all connected to the same rip current conditions the National Weather Service had been broadcasting continuously across the region. Hunter, Ray, and Richardson were 3 names within that larger, grim count, each death carrying its own version of the same preventable chain, each family learning the same lesson at the same terrible cost, on beaches that looked, from a distance, entirely indistinguishable from one another. In the wake of the tragedy, officials renewed public calls for better beach safety education, clearer explanations of the flag system for out-of-town visitors, more visible signage at beach access points, and above all, a request that people treat a red flag with the same seriousness as a closed road or a downed power line. Not a suggestion, a boundary. Tourism boards and local governments discussed additional signage, additional lifeguard presence, additional outreach aimed specifically at visitors unfamiliar with the coast, the people most likely to misjudge water they had never stood in front of before, the people arriving with excitement instead of experience. It is worth noting what did not change. The Gulf did not become more violent after these deaths. Conditions did not spike into some rare, unforeseeable event that no one could have predicted. The water on the 22nd of June behaved exactly as it had on the 21st, exactly as the forecast said it would, days in advance in plain language, available to anyone who checked a phone before checking a swimsuit. The only thing that changed was which names the current carried, and how many families would spend the rest of their lives marking a date on a calendar that used to mean nothing. The ocean never changed, only the names of the people caught in it did. The chain never depended on one catastrophic mistake, it depended on dozens of ordinary ones, stacked quietly on top of each other until the weight of them became fatal. The trip could have ended differently before anyone left Birmingham. It could have ended with checking the surf forecast the night before, a search that takes less time than packing a bag. It could have ended with asking a lifeguard what the red flag meant, a 30-second conversation that cost nothing and asked for nothing but humility. It could have ended with waiting until conditions improved, with choosing the pool instead of the Gulf for one afternoon. It could have ended the moment someone looked at that warning and decided the Gulf would still be there tomorrow. Because it would have been. It always is. It is patient in a way people rarely are, and it does not punish patience the way it punishes haste. Harold Hunter, Jamonda Ray, and Marius Richardson weren't reckless caricatures. They were young fathers looking forward to a weekend at the beach, doing what countless visitors do every summer without consequence, making choices that thousands of other people make on thousands of other afternoons and walk away from unharmed. The water didn't target them. It didn't become angry. It simply remained indifferent to the confidence of the people standing on its shoreline, exactly as indifferent as it had been the day before and would be the day after. That indifference is what makes these stories so difficult to hear, right? And so important to remember, because the next red flag will fly for someone else. The next rip current will form exactly the same way, in exactly the same kind of deceptively calm water, in front of exactly the same kind of tired, excited travelers stepping out of a car after a long drive. And unless someone chooses differently, unless someone stops at the flagpole instead of walking past it, unless someone asks the question instead of assuming the answer, the ending will be exactly the same. He cried, and every step of it was preventable. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. It might be the cheapest piece of survival gear you ever pick up. Want more preventable? These stories are next. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching.